Trespass was the second Genesis album. The first, which they'd written all the songs for, was in fact more of a Jonathan King creation.
When you're that age, teenage, you want to make a record and you don't really mind who you make it with or how you make it. So although Trespass is the second Genesis record, most people would count it as their first real effort.
Trespass is where Genesis laid down the basic style that was to serve them for the next 3 or 4 years.
Well, I think it really started to define the Genesis sound. You had tracks like The Knife, which is an absolute classic.
It's a really good album. It's now 35 years on and it still stands the test of time, and it's very, very much worth going back and revisiting. It's a superb LP.
The Knife was a powerful, dramatic song, and it was the first song that Genesis did that really got crowds going. That was when they knew they were onto something.
The Knife was always the highlight of Genesis live in concert. And if you look at the early footage, you do see some great performances by Peter Gabriel when he's enacting a riot scene with his use of the microphone stand, and he's using it as a gun, and he's the policeman trying to control the crowd, and then he adopts the persona of the downtrodden crowd. Interestingly, you've got Phil Collins blowing away on the whistle and thumping the drums. The Knife was a real standout highlight of their on-stage performance.
The aggressive keyboard riff that powers the song and Peter Gabriel's strident rallying call, "Stand up and fight, for you know we are right," made for a very potent stage performance. And it was proof, really, that Genesis could make their somewhat cerebral musical style work in a live context.
Some of you are going to die. Marching up north, the freedom of the mind. Now! Now! Now!
The Knife had the energy, sort of throbbing bass, fantastic drumming. It was probably as heavy as Genesis were ever going to get, but it's a very exciting piece of music.
The Knife was the song that got Genesis signed to Charisma. They were doing a lot of new stuff in their act, and it was a very impressive kind of statement of intent, something to do with the revolution, which was a big thing back in the 60s. We all had posters of Che Guevara on the wall. And I think really what they were saying was, rather like Pete Townsend, it's meet the new boss, same as the old boss, the idea that the revolutionaries of today are the dictators of tomorrow. So it was a song with a message. They got a musical backdrop to go with it that hammered the point home, and it was the song more than anything else that really got Charisma interested in signing the band.
Wash away the past. My long lost friend is smiling from above, smiling at my tears. Come, we'll walk the path to take us to my home. Keep outside the night. The ice cold night has come to decorate the dead. Somehow
Stagnation's quite a wonderful track. And it really does have the style of very old Genesis, a la the first album. But you can definitely hear the later Genesis traits coming through. And it really is quite a beautiful piece of music.
The idea of building a song via a couple of acoustic guitars and a tinkling piano in between, sort of lulling the listener into a dreamy world. And then gradually more electric guitars and a beat comes into play and drives the song forward, reaching one climax after another. And this idea of repeatedly building the climax and then taking it back down again.
The lyrics were very much about a nuclear apocalypse, which everyone was worried about, with America and Russia having been neck and neck with brinkmanship and who was going to fire the first nuke. It's something we obviously were not perhaps so worried about now, but back in those days it was certainly something that a teenager would worry about. Would they grow up to have children? Would they grow up to have a family? Could they do everything that they wanted to do before basically the end of the world came? Anthony Phillips, I know, was not really keen on the result of Stagnation. I think he felt that there should have been more time spent in putting the thing together. But there's a certain eerie feel to it, as a kind of eerie keyboard feel that, with Tony Banks obviously coming to prominence, which he was in the early days. I think it did make for a very post-apocalyptic sound, and certainly I would say it was quite effective.
That I may join with you. All your hearts now seem so far from me. It hardly seems to matter now. And the nurse will tell you lies of the kingdom beyond the skies. But I am lost within this hard world. It hardly seems to matter now. Play me my song. Here it comes again. Play me my song. Here it comes again.
The Musical Box was the only song that Genesis had written and performed live before they started recording. It uses the same theme of stagnation in building instrumental climaxes repeatedly, but this time the music perfectly mirrors the dark undertow of Peter Gabriel's lyrics.
Without doubt, The Musical Box is the highlight of the Nursery Crime album. It's possibly also one of the highlights of the entire Genesis career.
Musical Box is a fantastic track on the album, but I don't think it was the actual highlight of the album.
It's a wonderful piece of storytelling. It's got a lovely texture of Victoriana. It's quirky, it's interesting musically, it's beautifully arranged, and for me, it stands the test of time amazingly well.
Peter Gabriel's skill in the musical box is drawing you into the story by making you feel that you've perhaps missed the first part of it. So you're constantly trying to pick up back references, which he provides. And gradually the song builds in this way. It also is helped immeasurably by having Phil Collins providing a professional, solid beat behind it.
What I remember about it really is Phil Collins taking it by the scruff of the neck and doing a bit of a Keith Moon, which certainly John Mayhew, the drummer that they had before, technically didn't really have the balls in his playing to do that.
A musical box works well because it's got sort of little tranquil Genesis parts that only early Genesis could do, and also the very exciting, vibrant, progressive feel. It's a dynamite piece of work.
Everything works in the musical box. The story's succinct and well told. It's very unusual and quirky, but the musical arrangements are absolutely sublime. Again, you've got to look to the quality of the work from Tony Banks. And Steve Hackett makes an immediate and dramatic impact on his arrival in the band.
The musical box takes its time to build, but once it's hit its first peak, Steve Hackett steams in with his first real guitar solo in Genesis and suddenly adds a whole new dimension to the band's range of sounds. The final climax of the song, after over 10 minutes, is perhaps one of the finest that Genesis ever achieved. And not surprisingly, it became the finale to their set for several years.
She's a lady, she's got time. No brush bash your hair. Just let me get you down her face.
If you look at Gabriel, you really need to see the early footage to really understand just how good a performer he was when he was performing the Genesis material. Because if you look at, for example, the Old Man section in the musical box, it doesn't really come across as well on record, but on stage, Gabriel really adopts the persona of the Old Man and gets under the skin of that character, and he's able to really project this sense of aging and sort of almost lechery that's under the surface there. And it's only when you see him on stage that you really appreciate just what a fine performer Gabriel was and how well he could interpret those songs.
It doesn't seem to matter now. Stand there with your recognition. Pass me down to know that
It had all the elements that old Genesis fans tend to treasure. It did stay in the set for quite a while. It was a set piece. It was something that they were keen to get over, and it's not something that they would put away easily. But yeah, it was a highlight of the early days, and I would say certainly the advent of Phil Collins was really what made it so special.
Return of the Giant Hogweed is sort of jaunty Genesis. It's almost like the Day of the Triffids, set in a sort of Victorian melodrama. The story in the song unfolds to some surprisingly funky rhythms for Genesis.
We start off with this keyboard and guitar riff in harmony with each other. And the riff is very busy, and it's meant to be describing this giant hogweed that sort of attacks and rampages the human race. So it's maybe a little bit too busy, but that's the way it was intended. And the two instruments in harmony, very close harmony, getting this sense of sort of something ominous is going to happen.
Songs like Hogweed work in musical terms because of the strength of the arrangements. You know, Tony Banks was crafting these amazingly well-structured and well-organised arrangements.
The piece is in G major, but it starts off in C minor, and we get this kind of chromatic run that moves the way down, so it actually ends up in G, although the song starts in C minor. And we get these two riffs in harmony with each other that just work so well.
Hogweed is something that did take on a life of its own. They wanted it to replace The Knife, and The Knife was a song that typically ended the show, so it had to be a real build-up climax. And Hogweed did that. One of the reasons it did was because Steve Hackett, who was now playing guitar instead of Anthony Phillips, was putting his stamp on proceedings, and he was a very able guitarist in the mould of Robert Fripp from King Crimson.
Steve Hackett's guitar playing is fantastic, and if you listen to the track carefully, you'll hear that he's got his solo work in there, which is I think overshadowed often by the keyboard playing, but also he plays what in some terms in today's world we call rhythm guitar or rhythm background guitar. And he's got a grungy feel in there.
Steve Hackett's solo in The Return of the Giant Hogweed sets his style quite neatly in that he plays quite melodically, but at the end of the phrase he'll add a deliberate dissonance which takes it away from anybody else. You can't say that it's copying another guitarist.
You've got this incredibly creative use of the guitar with this little chugging guitar obligato, I suppose, that Steve Hackett delivers. It really is very unusual and musically very stimulating.
He'd press his part on the song, he'd leave his imprint on the song, and certainly the solo at the end of Giant Hogweed is still one of the ones that his fans will remember him for in a Genesis context.
Steve Hackett brought a kind of double-edged sword to Genesis. He was the guitarist they desperately needed. His sound gave them a new element in their expanded repertoire of sounds, which was very important in terms of the way they built their songs. He also had a distinctive style of his own, and he gave Genesis a sort of credibility among guitarists.
He didn't have a desire to push himself to the forefront, so Genesis were able to do something which was different from everybody else. They didn't have loud wailing guitar solos. They had the guitar woven into the structures of the songs, and that's what was the essence of Genesis.
I think Steve Hackett felt that he was never really accepted by the others, regardless of whether or not he actually was, and he let that bother him. If Phil Collins, who joined at the same time, felt the same thing, he didn't let it bother him.
Rises like an island within a hidden cave. Nymphs and gifted child, Hermaphroditus, son of gods, so up in the desert. As the dawn creeps up the sky, the hunter caught sight of a togo in desire for conquest. He found himself with an acclaim not beheld before. Where are you, my father? Give wisdom to your son.
Typically Genesis were working on 8 to 10 minute pieces at this period, and they were really at the very top of their game. There were these wonderful symphonic arrangements which were driven largely by Tony Banks' unique ability.
Tony Banks called a song like Fountain of Salmacis an odyssey rather than a song. It was a story that went from A to B, and perhaps people weren't necessarily sure where it was going to go. Ended up where it ended up. Could be a little bit different each night when they were playing it.
Fountain of Salmacis was the first song that Tony Banks worked on after he'd bought a Mellotron. It was in fact King Crimson's third Mellotron. And he found that it added another range of sounds to his particular keyboard armoury.
In the introduction of the Fountain of Salmacis, we get this wonderful Mellotron string flush of the chords, these two chords, C major 7 and D. And the Mellotron starts, and then it's faded up and off again. And then we get this running riff at the top, which goes.
Tony Banks was able to give Fountain of Salmacis a more formal structure in terms of chords, but a broader structure in terms of the sounds that he could produce. And that, combined with the gentle, jazzy, swinging section in the middle, gave the song real life and vitality.
Fountain of Salmacis, fantastic track, and there's some great bass playing in there.
Fountain of Salmacis is perhaps the first song where Mike Rutherford fully explores the possibilities of his own bass playing.
Michael Rutherford has always been an inspired bass player, and in addition we have these wonderful bass pedals, which just adds that extra kind of secret element to the Genesis sound that shouldn't be overlooked.
He follows each change within the song by coming up with an appropriate line that's inventive and moves from the hard, static rock riffs to the more flowing elements of the song, and he keeps pace with that magnificently.
Crawl into the lake, a fading voice was heard, and I beg, yes I beg, that all who touch this spring may share.
Musically, Nursery Crime was a great step forward for the band, but in commercial terms it didn't really sell any more than the previous album Trespass had sold.
I think it did show a step on from Trespass, and of course with Foxtrot coming up, that was going to be another quantum leap for Genesis.
Nursery Crime is an album now, you know, over 30 years later, and you go back and listen to the early Genesis albums, I think it's one of the most listenable of the Gabriel albums.
With Watcher of the Skies, Genesis are finally in your face. The two chords that Tony Banks opens the song with, that he repeats in various shapes and sizes, really set the tone for the whole album.
A Watcher of the Skies became, you know, a live mainstay, and it's a brilliant track.
It sort of set the tone and the style with this mystery and this the storytelling of Gabriel and the costumes and the whole mood of a Genesis concert. It became the opener, not just of Foxtrot the album, but also on stage. And it really does capture the excitement and the essence of what Genesis were about.
It's as if Genesis have worked out all the elements that they know work best and piled them all together, and yet given them space as well. It doesn't feel as if the song lasts for 7.5 minutes, because your attention is constantly drawn by something new. And even with 30 seconds to go and the song building to the final ultimate climax, they've still got something new to throw into the pot.
The song clearly had something, and in fact it was written by Tony and Mike. I think when they were touring in Italy, they looked out from their hotel and they envisaged a kind of a moonscape or something, and certainly the sound of the track sounded a bit like a spaceship landing. So if you came into a Genesis gig and suddenly you had the noise of a spaceship landing, that was something that took you onto another level, almost literally.
Walking across the city wall, I turn the television off. Sitting beside you, I look into your eyes. As the sound of motor cars fades in the night time, I swear I saw your face change. It didn't seem quite right. And it's hello, babe, with your guardian eyes so blue. Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true?
Supper's Ready is a monumental 23-minute epic from Genesis that starts with settling down to an evening's TV viewing and lands up with the apocalypse.
Genesis have had many fine moments, and Supper's Ready, I think most long-time fans who've been into them since the early 70s would be one.
Just a fucking great song.
If you look at it, it actually starts with a good 3 or 4 minutes before the drums come in, where they just use the arrangement of these arpeggios to drive the rhythms, and it works gorgeously.
And it's, hey, babe, your supper's waiting for you. Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true?
Surprisingly for Genesis, the song starts quite abruptly No long introductions, no preamble, just Peter Gabriel filling in the story at once. But within 2 minutes, you're firmly hooked, and this enables the group to take off on one flight of fantasy after another.
It's a progressive epic, and it's not an epic in the sense that, in a progressive way, the way Emerson, Lake and Palmer played or Yes played. There's a real story to what they do, and I think a lot of Genesis early music was like that. You had a story, and a very well told story, and that was one of Gabriel's real traits.
Supper's Ready is a 22-minute long song, and to be honest, to actually maintain a listener's attention for that amount of time, you've got to really come up with something quite special. And I think Genesis did this in this case.
It's probably the band almost reaching their peak as a unit. The storytelling is interesting and varied. The arrangements are wonderful.
So with Supper's Ready, the first track, Lover's Leap, it's a wonderful kind of love song really, very powerful lyrics I think. But it starts off with an A-6 chord, which is quite an unusual chord to start off any song really. And the song is in B major. But then for the chorus, we have this modulation passage which sort of moves through a couple of keys into B flat major. So it's quite an unusual thing to do, start off in B, and then instead of going up for the chorus, it's actually moving down one semitone, but because of this fantastic modulation, it doesn't feel like it's going down, it feels like it's going up.
Supper's waiting for you. Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true? I've been so far from you, far from your warm arms. It's good to feel you again. It's been a long, long time.
It was a typical song that they had then, in as much as it was several songs within a song, several ideas shoehorned together, building up to the big Apocalypse in 9/8.
When we come to the Apocalypse in 9/8 section, you have this real sense of menace which comes from the unusual, quirky time signature allied to the arrangement. So it's not something that's done for the sake of it, it's done to achieve a musical effect.
Supper's Ready is an elaborate construction, but it's one that the band can perform with ease because it constantly harks back to their own core values. and therefore it's easy for them to do.
This was really a bit of a manifesto from Genesis, and it was also something that the critics hated. So if you were a fan, it was something to love. If you were a critic, it really reinforced all the negative thoughts that you had about Genesis.
Foxtrot was the breakthrough album for Genesis in Britain and Europe. It also provided them with a launch pad for America.
I think it's interesting if you look at Genesis's early music, i.e. the Gabriel and Hackett years, almost every album they did was a clear improvement on the previous album.
Not a classic, but certainly it brought all the elements together in a much more cohesive way than we'd seen before. It had the artwork by Richard Whitehead, who was the chief designer of Time Out, if I remember rightly. At that point, the artwork and the band and the music were all considered by the fans of a piece, and Peter Gabriel would take some of his visual clues from the artwork, and Foxtrot more than others. He took the fox's head and the red dress and he went on stage with them, created a little bit of a stir, didn't tell the band about it either, so they were as shocked as the audience were. And it really helped him kick ahead as a focal point and a character.
The costumes that Peter Gabriel adopted were a revelation at the time. When we look at the famous red dress and fox's head, which he would suddenly appear as, it added a sense of what was considered to be real shock at the time, but it brought this huge sense of theatre to the stage. And that's what Gabriel was very good at. He was a brilliant communicator.
You touch me, why don't you touch me, touch me, touch me now, 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 now,
Foxtrot also gave Genesis a stronger fan base, and people who picked up on the group buying the Foxtrot album, and a lot of people did, within 6 months they would also have bought the Nursery Crime album and were then waiting eagerly for what was to follow.
I am the voice of Britain before the Daily Express. My name is Britannia. This is my song. It's called Dancing with the Moonlit Night.
Can you tell me where my country lies? Cried the unicorn to his true love's eyes. It lies with me, cried the Queen of Maybe. For her merchandise, he traded in his price. Paper late, cried a voice in the crowd. Old man dies, the note he left was signed on Father Thames. It seems he's drowned, selling England by the pound.
Dancing with the Moonlight Night takes a somewhat romanticised view of English life in contrast to the commercialised 70s, if you like, hence the phrase, selling England by the pound.
Dancing in the Moonlight Night was almost a title track for Selling England by the Pound because it was so quintessentially English. The title of the album had actually come from the Labour Party manifesto for an election, and so there's a little bit of cynicism in there, and that came over in the lyrics here because we were looking at the sort of a slightly cynical view of English society, the deterioration of society and how things were going down the tubes.
Does it succeed musically? Absolutely. It's probably the best song that Genesis has ever recorded that could foreseeably be played on radio.
Dancing with the Moonlit Night, it's in C-sharp minor, and for me the special part of the song is really the sort of the Steve Hackett guitar riff, It's so simple, but it's so provocative. I think that's the word, and it sort of encapsulates what the track is about, really.
While the band take their time to build, when the song finally does reach its climax, it's perhaps one of the most powerful and yet concise peaks that the band have ever played. Unfortunately, right at the end, they do tend to cram a bit too much into it. It's the first time that you perhaps hear something of an overload in Genesis instrumentally.
Great live track, great if you ever heard it on the radio, but it wasn't overly long, so I don't think people ever lost interest in it. And the dynamics of the song were almost second to none with anything Genesis had ever done before, and I think anything that Genesis ever tried to follow up with.
There's always been echo. Jacob, wake up, you got to tidy and run now. And then Mr. Lewis, isn't it time when he was out on his own? Over the garden wall, two little lovebirds, do-do-do-do. Keeping the one blade sharp, I know.
I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe came out of a jam session. It started with a Steve Hackett riff, which was very Beatlesy in tone, but Genesis were able to turn it their own way.
It was a song that had the slightly off-kilter appeal of something that maybe Jethro Tull might have done, Living in the Past, the same kind of hop, skip and a jump that the best Jethro Tull had.
Typical of Genesis in many ways, with the vocal, the lyrics, and the way they put it together musically. Personally, it's not my favourite on the album, but I can see why they chose it as a single, and I think it was a very, very good choice as a single, and it works well on the album.
I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe could have been a bigger single if Genesis had actually appeared on Top of the Pops. They never did. Nobody's quite sure whether it's because they refused, which I think they like to tell people they did, or whether they just couldn't fit it into their touring commitments.
I think they recognised quite early on that they did have a potential hit on their hands, but they tended to be somewhat embarrassed by it. Genesis weren't about having hits at that particular time.
Hit singles were sort of scorned and looked down upon, but Genesis suddenly found they did have a workable single, so why not put it out?
You've got to realise that Genesis fans were certainly album buying fans. They weren't people who bought 7-inch singles by The Sweet or Gary Glitter. And in many ways, perhaps going on Top of the Pops would have been a retrograde step for Genesis, because they'd have risked alienating the fans who stuck with them from the beginning.
But of course, having a hit brought Genesis to a whole new audience who were, by 1974, quite receptive to the music that Genesis was playing. In a sense, the rest of the music world had caught up with what Genesis had been doing. And it provided them with another stronger fan base. Selling England by the Pound is perhaps one of the great underrated Genesis albums.
I think Selling England by the Pound was the best album Genesis has ever done. Just the best.
It stood the test of time well. It still repays a listen. Anytime you go back and listen to Selling England by the Pound, you'll find some tremendous things that you'd overlooked or forgotten about.
Musically, it was certainly a carry-on from Nursery Crime and Foxtrot, but I think the songs were more cleverly integrated, and it wasn't that it was a concept album, they just seemed to follow on very, very well. And you know, that is as much as arranging the tracks in order. In other words, finding your track listing when you're first putting your album together. Something as simple as that can actually make the difference between a good album and an extremely good album. And I think they got it right with this one.
The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway wasn't a hit out of the box. It's something that I think has grown in stature over the years. Certainly the fact it was the last thing that Peter Gabriel did with the band.
I think The Lamb was a fitting swan song for the Gabriel years. Gabriel had really taken his work with Genesis as far as he could, and it really was time for him to begin to embark on his career as a solo performer.
The Lamb saw Peter Gabriel take on the role of Rail, who was a guy who was trying to make his life in New York City, an immigrant. And on stage he'd basically play the part of Rail, and he'd be going around in a leather jacket with his hair greased back, looking a bit like a thug. Certainly it wasn't the sort of thing that he'd been dressing up in before. But the payoff was at the very end when he turned into Slipper Man, which was a kind of strange, bulbous creature. And if you've been waiting to see if there was going to be a sting in the tail, there was.
Yeah, Gabriel had become a wonderful showman, and possibly The Lamb suffered from the fact of being conceived too much with the stage show in mind.
The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway showed that Gabriel and the band were finding it increasingly difficult to work together to the same end. It wasn't so much Peter Gabriel's showmanship that was a problem for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It was more the unwieldy concept that he constructed that he hadn't really mapped out in advance.
It's been looked upon as the climax to Genesis' career. I'm not sure I would say it was that, and obviously another chapter of the band was to come anyway. But certainly it's something that people feel with the two albums preceding it was one of the Magic Trilogy, one of the albums that Genesis with Peter Gabriel will always be remembered for.